The Poor Miller's Boy and the Cat, a tale of Brothers Grimm. In a certain mill lived an old miller who had neither wife nor child, and 3 apprentices served under him. As they'd been with him several years, he one day said to them, "I am old and want to sit in the chimney corner. Go out, and whichever of you brings me the best horse home, to him I will give the mill. In return for it, he shall take care of me till my death." Now the third of the boys was the drudge, who was looked on as foolish by the others. They begrudged the mill to him, and afterwards he would not have it. Then all 3 went out together, and when they came to the village, the 2 said to stupid Hans, "You may as well stay here. As long as you live, you will never get a horse." Hans, however, went with them, and when it was night, they came to a cave in which they lay down to sleep. The 2 sharp ones waited till Hans had fallen asleep, then they got up and went away, leaving him where he was. They thought they had done a clever thing, but it was certain to turn out ill for them. When the sun arose and Hans woke, he was lying in a deep cavern. He looked round on every side and exclaimed, "Oh heavens, where am I?" And he got up and clambered out of the cave, went into the forest, and thought, "Here I am quite alone and deserted. How shall I obtain a horse now?" While he was thus walking full of thought, he met a small tabby cat, which said quite kindly, "Hans, where are you going?" "Alas, you cannot help me." "I well know your desire," said the cat. "You wish to have a beautiful horse. Come with me and be my faithful servant for 7 years, and I shall give you one more beautiful than any you have ever seen before in your whole life." "Well, this is a wonderful cat," thought Hans, "but I am determined to see if she is telling the truth." So she took him with her to her enchanted castle, where there were nothing but cats, who were her servants. They leapt nimbly upstairs and downstairs, and were merry and happy. In the evening, when they sat down to dinner, 3 of them had to make music. One played the bassoon, the other the fiddle, and the third put the trumpet to his lips and blew out his cheeks as much as he possibly could. Now when they dined, the table was carried away, and the cat said, "Hans, come and dance with me." "No," he said, "I won't dance with a pussy cat. I've never done that yet." "Then take him to bed," said she to the cats. So one of them lighted him to his bedroom. Next pulled his shoes off, one pulled off his stockings, and the last blew out the candle. The next morning they returned and helped him out of bed. One put on his stockings for him, one tied his garters, one brought his shoes, one washed him, and one dried his face with her tail. "Well, that's quite soft," said Hans. However, he had to serve the cat and chop some wood every day. To do that, he had an axe of silver, and the wedge and the saw were of silver, and the mallet of copper. So he chopped the wood small. He stayed in the house and had good meat and drink, and never saw anyone but the tabby cat and her servants. Once she said to him, "Go mow my meadow and dry the grass." She gave him a scythe of silver and a whetstone of gold, and bade him deliver them up again carefully. So Hans went and did what he was bidden, and when he had finished the work, he carried the scythe, whetstone, and hay to the house, and asked if it was not yet time for his reward. "No," said the cat. "First you must do something more for me of the same kind. There is timber of silver, carpenter's axe square, and everything is needful, all of silver. Build me a small house." So Hans built a small house, and said he had now done everything, and still he had no horse. Nevertheless, the 7 years had gone by with him as if they were 6 months. The cat asked if he would like to see her horse. "Yes," said Hans, and she opened the door of the small house, and when she had opened it, there stood 12 horses, such horses so bright and shining his heart rejoiced at the sight of them. And she gave him to eat and drink, and said, "Go home, I will not give you your horse with you, but in 3 days' time I shall follow along and bring it." So Hans set out, and she showed him the way to the mill. She had, however, never once given him a new coat, and he had been obliged to keep on his dirty old smock frock, which he had brought with him, and which during the 7 years had everywhere become too small. Now when he reached home, the other 2 apprentices were there as well. Each of them had certainly brought a horse with him, but one of them was a blind horse, and the other lame. They asked Hans where his horse was. "It will follow me in 3 days' time." Then they laughed, and said, "Indeed, stupid Hans, and where will you get a horse? It will be a fine one." Hans went into the parlor, but the miller said he shouldn't sit to table, for he was so ragged and torn they would be ashamed of him if anyone came in. So they gave him a mouthful of food outside, and at night, when they went to rest, the others would not let him have a bed. At last he was forced to creep into the goose house and lie down on hard straw. In the morning when he awoke, the 3 days had passed, and a coach came with 6 horses, and they shone so bright it was delightful to see them. The servant brought a 7th as well, which was for the poor miller's boy. A magnificent princess, however, alighted from the coach and went into the mill. This princess was the tabby cat whom poor Hans had served for 7 years. She asked the miller where the miller's boy and drudge was, and the miller said, "We cannot have him here in the mill, he is so ragged. He's lying in the goose house." So the king's daughter said they were to bring him out immediately, and they brought him out, and he had to hold his smock frock together to cover himself. Now the servants unpacked splendid garments and washed him and dressed him, and when that was done, no king could have looked more handsome. And the maiden desired to see the horses which the other princesses had brought home with them, and she saw that one of them was blind and the other was lame. So she ordered the servants to bring the 7th horse, and when the miller saw it, he said, "Such a horse as that never yet entered his yard." "And that is for the 3rd miller's boy," said she. "Then he must have the mill," said the miller. But the king's daughter said the horse was there, and he was to keep his mill as well, and took her faithful Hans and set him in the coach and drove away with him. They drove first to the little house which he had built with the silver tool, and behold, it was a great castle, and everything inside was of silver and gold. Then she married him, and he was rich. So rich he had enough for all the rest of his life. And after this, let no one ever say that anyone who is silly could never become a person of importance. The Old Woman in the Wood. A tale of Brothers Grimm. A poor servant girl was once traveling with the family with which she was in service through a great forest, and when they were in the midst of it, robbers came from the thicket and murdered all they found. All perished together except the girl, who had jumped out of the carriage in a fright and hidden herself behind a tree. Now when the robbers had gone away with their booty, she came out and beheld the great disaster, and began to weep terribly, and said, "What can a poor girl like me do now? I do not know how to get out of the forest. No human being lives in it, and I must certainly starve." She walked about and looked for a road, but could find none. When it was evening, she seated herself beneath a tree, gave herself to God's keeping, and resolved to sit, waiting, and not go away, let what might happen. When, however, she had sat there for a while, a white dove came flying to her with a golden key in its mouth. It put the little key into her hand, and said, "Do you see the great tree? Therein is a lock. It opens with the key, and there you will find food enough and suffer no more hunger." So she went to the tree and opened it, and found milk in a little dish and white bread to break into it so she could eat her fill. When she was satisfied, she said, "It's now the time when the hens go home to roost. I am so tired I could go to bed too." So the dove flew to her again and brought another golden key in its bill, and said, "Open that tree there, and you will find a bed." So she opened it and found a beautiful white bed. She prayed to God to protect her during the night, and lay down and slept. In the morning the dove came for a 3rd time, again bringing a little key, and said, "Open that tree there, and you will find clothes." And when she opened it, she found garments beset with gold and jewels, more splendid than those of any king's daughter. So she lived there for some time, and the dove came every day and provided her with what she needed, and it was a quiet, good life. Once, however, the dove came and said, "Will you do something for my sake?" "With all my heart," said the girl. "Then," said the little dove, "I will guide you to a small house, enter it, and inside it an old woman will be sitting by the fire, and say, 'Good day.' On your life, give her no answer, let her do what she will. Pass by her on the right side. Further on there is a door which you must open. Then you will enter into a room where there are a quantity of rings of all kinds, among which are some magnificent ones with shining stones. Leave them, however, where they are, and seek out a plain one, which must likewise be among them, and bring it as quickly as you can." So the girl went to the little house and came to the door. There sat an old woman who stared when she saw her and said, "Good day, my child." The girl gave her no answer and opened the door. "Aye!" cried the old woman, and seized her by the gown, and wanted to hold her fast, saying, "That is my house. No one can go in if I choose not to allow it." But the girl was silent, got away from her, and went straight into the room. Now there lay on the table an enormous quantity of rings, which gleamed and glittered before her eyes. She turned them over and looked for the plain one, but could not find it. While she was seeking, she saw the old woman, and she was stealing away, wanting to get off with a bird cage in her hand. So she went after her and took the cage from her, and when she raised it up and looked into it, a bird was inside that had the plain ring in its bill. Then she took the ring and ran quite joyously home with it, and thought the little white dove would come and get the ring. But it did not. Then she leaned against a tree and determined to wait for the dove, and as she stood, it seemed as if the tree was soft and pliant and letting its branches down. Suddenly the branches twined round her and were arms, and when she looked round, the tree was a handsome man who embraced and kissed her heartily and said, "You've delivered me from the power of the old woman who is a wicked witch. She changed me into a tree, and every day for 2 hours I was a white dove, and as long as she possessed the ring I could not regain my human form." Then his servants and his horses, who had likewise been changed into trees, were freed from the enchantment as well, and stood beside him. And he led them forth to his kingdom, for, of course, he was a king's son, and they married and lived happily. The end. Jorinda and Jorindel, a tale of Brothers Grimm. There was once an old castle in the middle of a deep wood, and in it an old woman who was a witch lived all by herself. In the daytime she was changed into a cat or a screech owl, but in the evening she took her proper shape again as a human being. She could lure wild beasts and birds to her, and killed and boiled and roasted them. If anyone came within 100 steps of the castle, he must needs stand still, and he could not stir from the place until she bade him be free. But whenever a young maid came within the circle, she changed her into a bird and shut her up in a wicker work cage and carried the cage into a room in the castle. She had 7,000 cages of rare birds in the castle. Now there was once a maiden called Jorinda who was fairer than all other girls. She and a handsome youth named Jorindel had promised to marry one another, and their greatest happiness was in being together. One day, in order they might be able to talk together in quiet, they went for a walk in the forest. "Take care," said Jorindel, "you do not go too near the castle." It was at the end of a beautiful day. The sun shot its beams between the trunks of trees, and the turtle doves sang mournfully upon the young boughs of the birch trees. Jorinda wept now and then. She did not know why. The sun was low in the west, and a sadness came over her. Jorindel was sorrowful too. They were as sad as if they were about to die. Then they looked round them and were quite at a loss, for they did not know by which way they should go home. The sun was half above the mountain, but the other half was set. Jorindel looked through the bushes and saw they were close by the castle, and he was filled with deadly fear. Jorinda was singing. "My little bird with the necklace red sings sorrow, sorrow, sorrow. He sings that the dove must soon be dead. Sings sorrow, jug, jug, jug." Jorindel looked for Jorinda. She was changed into a nightingale and sang jug, jug, jug. A screech owl with glowing eyes flew 3 times round about her, and 3 times cried, "Woo-hoo! Woo-hoo! Woo-hoo!" Jorindel could not move. He stood like a stone, and could neither weep nor speak, nor move hand or foot. The sun had now set. The owl flew into the thicket, and at once there came out of it a crooked old woman, yellow and lean, with large red eyes and a hooked nose, the point of which reached to her chin. She muttered to herself, caught the nightingale, and took it away in her hand. Jorindel could neither speak nor move from the spot. The nightingale was gone. At last the woman came back and said in a hollow voice, "Greet thee, Zachiel. If the moon shines on the cage, Zachiel, let him loose at once." And Jorindel was freed. He fell on his knees before the woman and begged she would give him back his Jorinda. She said he should never have her again, and went away. He called, he wept, but all in vain. "What is to become of me?" Jorindel went away, and at last came to a strange village. There he kept sheep for a long time. He often walked round and round the castle, but not too near it. At last he dreamt one night he found a blood-red flower, and in the middle of it was a beautiful large pearl. He dreamt again he picked the flower and went with it to the castle, and everything he touched with the flower was freed from enchantment. He also dreamt that by means of it he set his Jorinda free. In the morning when he awoke, he began to seek over hill and dale for the flower he had seen in his dreams. 7 days he sought for it, and then early in the morning he found the blood-red flower. In the middle of it was a large dewdrop as big as the finest pearl. Day and night he went on his way with this flower to the castle. When he was within 100 steps of it, he was not held fast, but walked on to the door. Jorindel was full of joy. He touched the door with the flower, and it sprang open. He walked in through the courtyard and listened for the sound of birds. At last he heard it. He went on and found a room from whence it came, and there the witch was feeding birds in the 7,000 cages. When she saw Jorindel, she was angry, very angry, and scolded, but she could not come within 2 steps of him. He did not take any notice, but went and looked at the cages with the birds. There were hundreds of nightingales. How was he to find his Jorinda again? And then he saw the old woman quietly take a cage with a bird in it and go toward the door. Swiftly he sprang toward her, touched the cage with the flower, and the old woman as well. She could now no longer bewitch anyone. And Jorinda was standing there, clasping him round the neck, and she was as beautiful as ever. The end.